Nobody can deny that we're living in a time of unprecedented change. Whether it's the climate, pandemics, AI, or political unrest, there are a lot of events that have us confused and wondering how to make sense of it all. My name is Rebecca Burnt, and I'm asking the big questions, like what is the long history of our planet and its people? What are the ideas and practices that help us find purpose and meaning and navigate change with courage, faith, and hope? This is the unfolding, faith beyond borders. Sometime in the last decade, the world seems to have gone tarot mad. There's been an explosion of people offering tarot reading services, as well as all manner of themed and specialty tarot decks. Some are kitschy and camp, like the plethora of cat tarots. Some are earnest and ideological. I can't tell you how many #resistance themed decks there are out there. And some are really beautiful works of art that are the product of a singular philosophical, spiritual, or artistic vision. For some, tarot is a fun game or exercise in playing with imagination and intuition. For others, it is an entree into a deeper current of timeless mystical truth. My own beginnings, or my own entry into the world of tarot, began when I found a copy of Meditations on the Tarot in the library while on retreat at a Catholic monastery back in 2014. It's an incredibly dense work of Christian mysticism that 10 years later, I still haven't worked my way through. From that, I moved on to other books like Rachel Pollack's classic 78 Degrees of Wisdom, and also Robert Place's The Tarot, History, Symbolism, and Divination. Those are just a few. There's a lot of, obviously, tons and tons of books on the tarot. And I eventually began reading cards for myself and others. While I love much of the whimsy, beauty, and creativity behind these newer decks, I learned pretty quickly that I got the best results in readings by sticking to the classics like the Rider-Waite-Smith, which is where we get the classic imagery that most of us associate with the tarot, and also Aleister Crowley's Thoth deck. I might prefer the artistry of a bespoke deck created by a collective of hipster artists, but my readings were always shit when I tried to use them. Why is this? Well, I think it's partly because those decks have been around for so long, the Rider-Waite and the Thoth and a few others, and they've been so widely used that they've developed a substantial tradition and current of energy that can be tapped into. In a way, when you read from one of the classic decks, you're drawing on the collective wisdom of all the people living and dead who have worked with these symbols before you. But it's also undoubtedly because the people who made the decks were deeply rooted in spiritual practice and ancient systems of symbolic correspondences involving numbers, images, concepts, and even planets and the zodiac signs. And it allowed them to layer meanings together in a systematic and comprehensive way that can produce consistent, if not always predictable, results. To use modern terminology, I would say that these decks have been really well programmed. At the same time, while I could get great results reading for other people, I continued to struggle when I was reading for myself. Why is that? Well, there's always an element of subjective intuition involved in reading, and that's great when you're trying to get inspiration or understand yourself better, but not so much when you're trying to get a bit of clarity on an emotionally fraught situation. For me, divination is not just about communing with my own inner wisdom, it's about getting perspective from a wisdom that is bigger than just me. And I found myself struggling to discern the larger meaning through the noise of my own attachments, aversions, and other emotional reactions. Enter the Tarot of the Holy Light. I first learned about this deck several years ago in a review from the great Benabel Wen, and she's got another fantastic website and some books that you should check out if you want to learn about tarot. And she absolutely raved about this deck, saying that it gave her, quote, crazy accurate results, and that, quote, the synchronicities you will experience with this deck will kind of freak you out, end quote. I knew I had to check it out. It pretty quickly became my go-to deck for personal work. I found that more than any other deck or tarot book, using the Holy Light together with its corresponding books seemed to give me incredibly penetrating insight into the questions I was asking. This deck is grounded in decades of research into the mystical and wisdom teachings that have shaped Western esotericism, and it particularly draws on the wisdom of Protestant theosophers like Jacob Boehme and the early Rosicrucians. The essays that correspond to each card are really wisdom teachings in their own right, and I found that they often had specific details that corresponded precisely to the situations I was seeking to illuminate. The Tarot of the Holy Light also has the best app that I've ever discovered for working with tarot on a personal level, and it's very inexpensive. I definitely recommend using it if you're wanting to know more about this deck, or downloading it if you want to know more about this deck. So today's guest is actually the creator of this deck, Christine Towler Payne, along with her husband, the artist Michael Dower. She created the Tarot of the Holy Light. Christine has been an esoteric researcher and practitioner in the Pacific Northwest since the 1970s. She wrote the core interpretive tarot text that launched the seminal and ever popular website tarot.com, and she continues to teach and offer consultations. Welcome, Christine.
Hi, hi, great to be here. I'm thrilled to be. That's a great introduction.
Oh, well, thank you. I'm really thrilled you're here because I've just been a big fan of your work for a while. And yeah, it's really cool to talk to you. So maybe you could start off by just telling us a little bit about your background. What got you interested in this current of esoteric spirituality and especially the tarot?
Tarot came and got me in 1970. It just basically leaped off a shelf in a used bookstore and asserted itself in my life, and it's been there ever since. I literally used it to organize my mind as I was moving into college years, which were a little strugglish if you think West Coast 1970, a lot of the cultural transformation. I was growing up in the Berkeley Bay Area, so there was a lot of experimentation and shamanic self heroic projection of people themselves into exotic experiences. And so I needed some order. I just needed something that gave me an outline. And that's what Tarot, I ran into the CC Zane deck first. Well, actually, I ran into a joke deck first, but then I got to CC Zane. And that deck is a black and white, so-called Egyptian. It belongs to a group that, a lineage that has a very strong anchor into Renaissance esotericism and back behind it. And so, although I don't buy everything the way they arranged it on the deck, because it's black and white and because it had astrological symbols on it, it forced me to think rationally, like literally rationate the ideas and organize them, um, according to a certain syntax. And so that syntax went into me and it started organizing all of my thoughts, not just when I was playing with Tarot. So the categories that Tarot was proposing, the 1 through 10 and the four suits, the body of royalties, 16 royalties, and then the 22 trumps, they just seemed like a really good, like a microscope into the natural world with the 40 elemental cards, the psychological world with the 16 royals, and then the archetype world, the world of the macrocosm, signs, planets, these higher ideas in the trumps. So it just sort of gave me the three worlds scenario, which you find in Valentin Tomberg. That's the anonymous of Meditations on the Tarot. He's an excellent exponent of the lineage tradition as it came down. He's fully educated in all the esoteric, inward looking ideas associated with Tarot. And he's, put himself there at the threshold to speak to the world and to speak back to Tarot and to be a translator for the,
Mhm.
worldly and philosophical. So I sort of put myself in that same position because it's been long enough now of operating this and learning astrology and learning all the other mantic arts, just at least exposing myself left, right, and center to what is the body of esoteric practice and what are the ideas that attach to that, so that I could go ahead and work the computer that I could see tarot is. And that's why it was possible for me to do that project with tarot.com, because I already had it internalized from that CC saying deck that the tarot itself is a calculation tool. It's a, just like we have our cell phone now with all of its powers and capabilities and access and whatever, they had their tarot deck and it was just as powerful and for all the same reasons.
Yeah, I mean, that's such an interesting current to pick up on. And I do want to maybe like go back just a little bit because I think my audience, I write about spiritual matters. A lot of times I am writing to people who come from kind of a Christian background. And though I've been pretty involved in like esoteric streams for at least a decade, I don't know that all of my audience is. It's to them,
Okay.
some of this stuff might be a little bit new.
Yes, I understand. You
Um,
know, oh, go ahead.
go ahead.
The departments on Western esotericism just started showing up in the universities in the year 2000. And
Yeah.
so the people like myself who have immersed themselves in this work before it became an academic category had to suffer with being marginalized. And we've been marginalized outside of the religions, we've been marginalized outside of the official philosophies, we've been marginalized outside of the sciences. And so it's just now dawning on the collective mind what we're talking about. Basically, esotericism is staying in connection with the cosmic design. Everything rests on the Earth's position in the solar system's position in the galaxy, and the galaxy's relationship to what might be bigger than that. Even from ancient times, we as the high levels, whatever the scientific minds that were alive at any given time, were working on astronomy and astrology in order to know what time it is, literally speaking, whether it's the prosaic time of the seasons, so you know when to plant, when to harvest, or whether it's more of the existential time of world ages or various eras. If you know anything about astrology, the mechanics of the solar system, it's that the planets closer to the sun go faster and faster than the Earth. There's several of them. And then the planets outside of the Earth go slower. And so they're all like hands on a clock, and they're each keeping time according to their own um, cycle, which gets slower and slower as you go from Mars to Jupiter to Saturn. These are the visible planets inside of the known solar system of antiquity. And everybody was watching them. Everybody, they didn't live in a time of everything electrified with streetlights and whatever. They all saw the sky and saw the changes, saw the constellations, saw the Milky Way, saw the moving planets. It was all overhead. So they knew they were living in a big clock. And the smarter minds, the engineering minds, the people who had a sense of the mechanics of what they were looking at, started even from the time of Pythagoras, trying to figure out what is the clock we're in. So that's what esotericism is. It's the constant eruption of this understanding of our place in the larger cosmos.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's something that when people say like, oh yeah, people were so silly back then, they believed in like this dumb stuff that the planets were like, giving the messages and stuff. And I'm like, well, the planets were giving the messages and they were teaching them how to perform complex mathematical calculations that basically laid the foundation for all of our culture and architecture and music and all these other things that we have
And
and
it's in
science.
the alphabet. It's
Yes.
in the alphabet, and the alphabet is on the cards. These are called the stoichia. Um,
Yeah.
and so this is the building blocks of matter, or the building blocks of what becomes the manifested universe, and their frequencies first, and then their patterns second, and then their substances third, and then they're the material world eventually. So it's this trickle down process of what in the religions they say is the cosmic Om, or the first breath of God, that sets everything vibrating and starts up the world, and then it works its way out, and then it works its way back, and then there's a quiet time, and then we do it again. And this is, uh, at the root of all the different creation myths I've ever found. It's sort of like God wakes up and says, "Oh, let's do this," breathes out into it, and there's suddenly a creation. And for a while, and for an eternal while, things happen, and we learn about it through how it happens. And we distill things like space travel and tarot decks out of all the happenings. And then, eventually it wraps back around again, and we get it, maybe get a chance to do it again. We'll see.
Yeah. Um, it's Tell us a little bit about the history of the tarot specifically and where it comes from.
The playing card deck came up from North Africa into the Iberian Peninsula and the southern Mediterranean in the late 1300s. So it's called the Mamluk Tarot. And
Oh, I didn't even realize that there was one before the what is it, the Visconti or the one that I always think of as being one of the earliest.
yeah, the Visconti decks that came out of that particular workshop were a response to these Arabic playing card decks hitting Southern Europe. And so they hit in Italy and they hit on the south coast of France and the Iberian Peninsula was a strong Muslim culture. And people realized the utility of this, of course, for gambling and game playing, but also Europe's response to this deck. So the deck was 1 through 10 in 4 suits with 3 royals, no queens. So
Hmm.
Europe's response was to add queens and make the 22 trumps.
Hmm.
And so you could buy a playing card deck and then you could buy adjunct cards to add to it. And there might be several layers of adjunct cards because the Min Chiati decks go up to a count of 109. So you have the 22 trumps, but they also have a series of zodiac. They have four elements. They have extra trumps. So depending upon the game you wanted to play and what region you lived in, you might, it's like they were game cards. So you
Mhm.
would buy sets of game cards and then piece them together in order what games you wanted to play.
Yeah, and
And
you can see the similarity if you look at a modern deck of playing cards and you've got 4 suits of like different symbols. They're not exactly the same ones, but then you've got like a jack and a king, and
yep,
um, but what you have, it seems with tarot is like it seems like there's a deeper sort of added layers of symbolism. First in the trumps, which are these things that get added to those 4 suits. It's like a system of 22 symbols. And then also in the later development with I think it starts with like the Golden Dawn and stuff where you start getting the pip cards, which are like those playing cards, get get pictures put on them.
right. You can illustrate it. That trend was trying to sneak in, but during the 1600s, the church cracked down on the free range production of decks and imposed a standard across Europe, and including a taxation scheme that meant that any decks that crossed borders had to have tax stamps on them, and the person who was carrying them had to pay a fee to get into the next country with them. So the situation really tightened down in the 1660s in order to keep the mad levels of esotericism off the faces of the cards, because they were starting to kind of get frisky, get a little unique about from one deck to the next. And there was getting to be some great commercial competition, but there was also intellectual competition because a picture speaks 1,000 words, and you can see people's occult and spiritual politics. Remember, when we're talking late 1300s, we're in the wake of the Crusades and this great disruption of European culture, where suddenly whole nations of peoples that had been pretty much kept out um, were now a part of the trading world, part of the literate world, part of the um, mercantile communities. Jews came to Europe, Islamic people, even Chinese people, people from India. That these trade routes opened and included Europe, where before they had been closed.
Mhm.
So um, the result was a great cultural mixing, which brought a lot of the learning that had gone extinct in Europe back into Europe from the Holy Land and from the Eastern Eastern Europe and parts east of there. So there was a tremendous revival. That was what the Renaissance was, of ideas that had been kept out for the longest time. And we're still, of course, under great, I mean, the Crusades were over, then they start the witch trials because they didn't complete the job that they meant to do. They were trying to stamp out Gnosticism and stamp out alternative religions in Europe. But anyway, there's a lot of politics here that stands behind what you see on the cards.
Mm. Can you think of any examples, like in any of the classic tarot imagery that like might correspond to some of the politics that you're thinking of?
Well, yes, I'm right now revising my first book, The Underground Stream, in order to sharpen up a point that I made then, but I don't think I defended it well enough. It's that in 1662, with this stamping down of the order that now everybody's only supposed to do Marseille style decks and nothing else, and here's the canon, and you can't depart from it. Um, nearly every major arcanum underwent a subtle change. And just to look at one of them, the devil card used to be the earliest forms of it. It's a shaggy composite demon with faces looking out of all of its joints, sometimes a face on the belly. And it's a harasser and um, stimulator of the force of taboo. So it arouses irrational fears in people who haven't got the capability of fighting them off. And so it's the demon of drought, of anxiety, dread, fear, grief, like just all the stuff that wrecks us and rips us down and makes us lose faith in our capabilities. So you come to this 1662 and suddenly for the first time you see this early form of, well, they called it typhon,
Mhm.
became the Baphomet figure, with female breasts and male genitalia and standing up on a well, some people might say a pillar, some people might say an anvil, with a sword in one hand and a bloody mess of something in the other. And there are two fawns or sylphs or degraded humans, naked humans, chained to the anvil. So as this transformation came about in general to try and forge the Marseille decks out of a whole bunch of kitschy individual uh, local popular decks, you saw this archetype come down onto the devil card where it suddenly moved away from the folk devil of the Europeans and it's moved towards a much more occultist symbol. Now, um, this just sort of crept in with this change. Nobody really remarked about it. I had to sit down and go through the US Games catalog of historical decks just to look at every single card and say, okay, well, when did this change happen? And I really didn't have a theory about it until I looked at everything. And then I realized, oh, they all shifted, this subtle shift. I have a whole list of it right here, things I'm working on. Um, yeah, the priestess took on the sealed book, the Isis form, for example, the standing between the two pillars and all that. That was not her original formulation under the veil.
Originally the P-Bess, right? Wasn't she more like the
Okay.
Pope Joan kind of figure?
Right. Yeah, in the Renaissance form, she was actually a historical figure of something that happened in the Visconti family. But suddenly now she's this idealized form, has all the qualities of Sophia. She's got her sealed book, which means she's taking on the qualities of the Virgin Mary. Um, uh, it's referring to the Isis image in the Vatican with the two pillars and the veil. So something shifted right there, and we just got used to seeing it. We just got used to seeing it, so we didn't realize, oh, there was a folk tarot for several hundred years before this formal trademarked, homogenized product came down with these modifications.
And so what happened there? Do you
uh yeah, it's a big story, but I think what has been happening all along is that the guilds of astronomical priests have had to shift their focus from one civilization to the next to stay alive. And so in one civilization, they're a formal, beloved priesthood, and they run the universities for their, Alexandrian culture. In the next period, they have to go underground and become fathers, try and figure out a new wineskins to pour it in. Then another group of them has to, split off perhaps and become Moses in the desert. I'm out of order here, but what I'm saying is, at all different times, you have people who are carrying some part of this lineage, and they realize they have to keep this alive, this understanding of where we are in relation to the solar system and where we are in relation to the galaxy, because this tracks the cataclysm cycle on the planet. And for
Mhm.
people not to be wiped out, we have to be able to see our cataclysms coming. The short ones that are just a couple hundred years long, that are dealing with the intermediate planets, Saturn and Jupiter, and the longer cycles that are quite long, that are dealing with the precession of the equinoxes. So the literal masons, the literal builders guilds, who built for the astronomers and built the henges, built the pyramids, built the ziggurats, built all these observatories at the center of all these ancient cultures, they had to keep themselves alive. So sometimes they're druids, sometimes they're Renaissance magi, sometimes they're, you know, ordinary people blended into society, but super fixated on certain ancient lines of thought.
Yeah.
We're showing up everywhere because we.
Yeah. Let me ask you about that because there's kind of a lot of debate about this idea because I think there's one idea that there's like always this sort of secret tradition that is somehow getting passed on in a very linear way through secret societies. And that often gets very kind of poo-pooed by historians. And my own sense is that there might be some of that going on, but it often doesn't seem like it always happens in a super organized or coherent way. And that maybe more of what it is that whatever this larger mind that's kind of dreaming all of us and holding all of us together sort of calls people into that lineage like during their lifetimes, like by making someone like you or whoever interested in these ideas, and then they kind of go and they find the underground stream and they find a way to tap into it and make that wisdom relevant for the time that they're living in. What do
That's
you?
what we have to do. Yeah,
Yeah.
because it's always, not only is this information that has been held out literally in the academic tradition of Western civilization, it was literally legislated out of the universities. So
Mm-hmm.
couldn't do it because we had the Catholic Church instead. But um, on top of that, you have to mature into this. It's such a big picture that it's like climbing a continuous ladder to get the pieces arranged where you've even got the mind to perceive what's being talked about. And also remember, there's only a certain percentage of us who are born with engineering brains, who can look at the lay of the land and see what happened geographically, what happened to the landscape when the electric lightning bolt came through, or what happened when the volcanoes came up. Certain people have that eye. They're looking over things and seeing the bigger patterns. And so this is why you find the Greek philosophers in the years BC measuring the circumference of the world by figuring out how to calibrate the sun at noon in one location 40 miles away from the sun at noon in another location. They use the reflection of the sun down a well to be able to realize, well, okay, if we're X number of paces apart and that happens here at this time and that happens 40 miles away at that time, then the earth has to be so big. That is an aboriginal mind dealing with the physics problems around them,
Yeah.
and say, okay, I'm going to use what I have available to figure out what's going on here. I know I'm in some kind of clockworks because I can see them going overhead. I can see what's moving and what's not. But how can I determine from what's actually around me what's going on here? And so we look back and we say, oh, they were superstitious and they didn't really know anything. That is so wrong. That is so
Hmm.
terribly wrong because they were actually able to do the thinking that we do now with computers, but without calculation. They were using numbers in an entirely different way than we are. And for example, just the simplest way, when we look at numbers and think of them as getting bigger, the more you add, the more numbers you add, the bigger it gets. No, they would look at numbers and say the more you add, the smaller it gets because they viewed everything inside the one. So
Hmm.
you're going to talk about two, that's a division of the one in half. You're going to talk about three, it's a triangulation of the one, all the way out. No matter how big the number gets, what's actually happening is your portions are getting smaller.
Hmm.
So when you can look, they're literally looking in the other end of the telescope. They're literally looking at the world in a reverse way as ourselves. Instead of looking at things that can be weighed and measured, they're looking at how things open and close. I'm being metaphorical, but basically their understanding of our stance in the solar system, you know, was governed by the vocabulary of um, viewing and not viewing, um, you know, the different aspects of astronomy become uh, modes of communication between the planets and modes of communication inside the psyche. And so they're working with a grid, a circular grid, actually, not just your rows and columns, but an actual expanding bullseye kind of grid where everything's running in curves and cycles. There are no straight lines. We think in straight lines. We think if, then. And we think that, somehow I could draw a bead directly from my if to my then. When actually these guys realize, no, it's a coil and you're circling around and you're going to be hitting all these trigger points all the way around, and none of it is going to be achieved by a straight line. So by living in a circular world where it's wheels within wheels and the divine clockwork, even though that wasn't expressed until the Renaissance, it wasn't said that way. But the wheels within wheels goes back to, that's a phrase from the Old Testament.
Ezekiel.
Yeah, so we're talking for a long time. People have been looking outwards for meaning instead of developing systems of weighing and measuring matter here on the ground. So it's a
Hmm.
completely other point of view. It's pretty fascinating. I've been totally engrossed in it. It's geometric thinking.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean it does carry through even though the church has like suppressed a lot of this stuff, or at least in the West, because I think in Byzantium they're still like preserving a lot of this stuff, and and it's when the Byzantine Empire falls and the scholars there kind of have to run for their lives that you get this influx into the West. And I do think also part of what is going on is like that point, Western Europe was still in a lot of ways much less cultured and much more fragmented than because they were the quote unquote barbarian tribes that had been like Christianized or whatever. They weren't necessarily as plugged into the old Greco-Roman civilization. So there's like
Right.
a couple of things going on. But one of the things that I think about how even like in the what is it, 11th or 12th century and stuff, you have Hildegard of Bingen making these like mandala like paintings that show illuminations that show these wheels within wheels kind of like symbolism, and that is very much the medieval model of the cosmos. There's some of that is retained even when a lot of the older knowledge is lost.
Exactly. So that's what I found in the structure of Tarot. That's why I say I, didn't know at the beginning that it was such a perfect reflection of the ancient cosmos. But the more I learned, the more I realized this was obviously built. And most of the Tarot world still sees it as sort of a loose patchwork of crazy ideas, and
Yeah.
they don't understand what is uh, the implicit order that that makes it be 78 cards in these three denominations with this particular mathematics in it. And so I'm lucky in that way that the first deck that I found was very specifically constructed in order to show exactly how each card is an equation, and it clues into astronomy and it clues into psychology through this fractal model of the world. And they didn't have the word fractal, but
They had as above, so below, as within, so without.
That's right. And the wheels within wheels. Yeah. So we're just, our job is to learn how to think like our ancestors, not to try and remodel our ancestors to think like us. And that's where, when I talk to people about the history of Tarot, I like to remind them that what we call traditional decks, the way the Crowley, all those are just the last 100 years. They're
Yeah,
absolutely just little islands sticking out of a giant ocean of Tarot that was already 500 years old before they showed up.
right.
And um, the attempt to reformat the Tarot for the modern era has to some degree brought a certain amount of confusion to the whole model, because it's important to learn what you're doing with the thing itself before you decide to be making all these massive modifications. And because the idea of the trumps being tied to the Hebrew letters being tied to the Stoichionic archetypes, because somewhere in there they wanted to change how the archetypes fall or how to denominate the signs and planets and all that on those. They just did a little swippy swappy with the numbers and threw it out of order. I mean, into order according to their point of view, but
Mhm.
out of the ancestral order of the inherited um, astro alphanumeric model, which comes to us from Babylon. So it was decided for commercial reasons to have something new and fresh.
Mhm.
These guys decided to be the ones to bring that. And they took all the time and trouble to translate Eliphas Levi so they could have all of his works and just cut out the parts that they didn't want to conform to. Or, yeah,
Yeah. And so now what you're talking about specifically is the decks that have come to us through the Dawn tradition. You call it the English tradition because, of course, they're all based in England, and that's in the late 19th century and kind of going into the turn of the 20th century. And that's where we get the Rider Waite, which comes from the Golden Dawn, and then, of course, also the Thoth. Maybe, yeah, you could talk a little bit more about because that's absolutely what most of us think of when we think of tarot. And even if you ask someone like, what are the two main tarot traditions? They'll say like Thoth and Rider Waite, right?
right.
And they might say Marseille if they know more about that. But then maybe you can tell us a little bit more about what is happening at that time and what's going on that change is made and why and what kind of why you think it kind of goes off base.
Well, I think there a big kerfluffle happened at the end of the um, 1800s, rolling into the 1900s, because we started discovering more planets in the solar system.
Hmm. Yeah.
Suddenly, we had Uranus, Neptune, and then eventually Pluto, and this completely upsets the architectonic structure of the tarot if you think you're supposed to add three more planets to the
Mhm.
22. So they basically had to break into the existing organizational structure. If they wanted to add those three in, they were going to have to parasite already existing values. So um, three cards that used to refer to the mother letters in the magical alphabets are suddenly up for grabs, or maybe the whole astrology is scrambled in order to siphon those three extra outer planets in. And so you actually see it. I made a big chart for my first book, The Underground Stream, which I'm about to reissue. And it shows all of the formal lineages of Tarot I could find across the 70s, 80s, 90s, just trying to tabulate who's using what bodies of correspondences. I wasn't talking about casual decks where they just threw a little sprinkling of astrology symbols around without any particular order. I was looking at decks that promoted themselves as representing the Hermetic cosmos on the cards. So I ended up with several lineages that originate in Europe, and then hanging off the chart at the bottom is the English decks that came later and basically broke the alphabet by putting the Fool at the beginning and shifting the alphabet letters one back on every trump in order to put Aleph on the Fool. So that's their innovation, however they would like to claim it. And they've certainly made a very strong case that the decks from the school are really great for scrying and visualization. There's millions of them. They've proliferated madly, So yes, if you're just riffing off the surface of the cards, they have encouraged a really tremendous proliferation of imagery to fill in the blank cards. But they're not referring backwards to the esoteric tradition because they
Mhm.
broke themselves away from it. Now, I found a Spanish lineage that also is kind of rumpled and struggling. There's 3 or 4 or 5 decks maybe from that model, and there's a controversy in that little group between whether they should just default back to the Hebrew use of the letters or whether they should break away from letters entirely and just manifest a cosmos without worrying about how the letters connect to the numbers, connect to the astrology, which is, again, this ancient astro alphanumeric tradition that comes to us from Babylon. So, literally, all the letters we use in every alphabet that writes, uh, in every culture that uses an alphabet, they come as their ephemeris widgets from the Babylonian ephemeris.
Oh, interesting. They're ephemeris widgets. So explain that a little bit more to us. What you mean by that?
I'm saying the 22 primordial characters, which we now think of as an alphabet, they represent the 12 signs,
Uh-huh.
7 visible planets, and the 3 celestial elements.
Okay.
And so the reason why you could understand the ephemeris and not nobody around you maybe would be because only a person who was educated would know how to read that gibberish on that square grid with rows and columns, because you would, depending on which column or row you were in, you could read them as numbers, or you could read them as astrology, or you could read them as letters. And so if you weren't educated, you wouldn't know how to flip these rows and columns around and get an ephemeris out of it. Have you
Yeah,
ever looked at an ephemeris? They're really concentrated
absolutely.
numbers. Yeah.
Yeah. And I just want to say for people who might be listening that don't know what an ephemeris is, um, ephemeris is like a chart that tells you where and when the planets are moving, basically. Like so you can look it up and you can say like on this date in the future, where will Saturn be? Or what planets will be in the sign of Leo, you know. And modern astrologers still use these. They make big, desk ephemeris that you can buy, although most people just use computer programs, including myself, use computer programs nowadays. But what you're saying is that these symbols were being used as an ephemeris.
They started out
Okay.
as numbers
Yeah.
and uh, astrological connections. And then the Phoenicians took them around the world, took the ephemeris around, and borrowed the letters or borrowed the widgets and used them as a primitive writing, enough at least to keep track of what was in their hold, keep a ship's log, this kind of thing. And then later, the Pythagoreans shaped it up with all the sound values and the greater understanding of harmonic theory and turned it into, because they wanted to make sonorous and beautiful, harmonically correct um, god names for their rituals. So they used the same principle and they drew the sound values. So the sound values of the letters came last,
Hmm.
or numbers and astrological references first. And then they had a long history before they actually got remodeled and polished up for use in naming and writing and literature. So it's been a long process of these things. They are envisioned as the tips of God's pen. The stoichia are the little nibs that, as God is writing the world, he uses a different pen for a different thing, and there's 22 of them. So they're the architectonic tones or frequencies that the divine mind uses to project its intent upon inert matter and raise up the world.
Yeah, and I'm just going to do this for people who, because we don't think about these things because we don't use them anymore. Like people might hear the nibs of the pen and not even know what they mean. But here, this right here is having a hard time seeing it because of the blurring on my my screen, but this is a calligraphy pen, and there are different nibs that you stick into the pen, depending on whether you want to make a broad line or a fine line, depending on whether you want to do sketching or, actually write something out. And so the stoichia that you're talking about, that means something like elements or building blocks, correct?
Yes, these are the literal, I would say they're frequencies on a scale. So
Yeah.
like from finest to thickest.
Yeah. And I mean, you find this kind of this understanding of pattern and the ways that like these different stoichia or building blocks can be combined in different ways. This gets kind of reflected through all of these different streams of esotericism. Like for instance, if you study Kabbalah and like the Shem angels, which you have a chart for correspondences also included in one of the books that accompanies your tarot deck. Um, it's this idea that there's this really, really long name of God that has all of these letters in it, and then you can take different bits of that name and you get the names for these different angels, and these angels are actually kind of like different energies or qualities that are emanating from God and helping to compose the universe that we live in.
Excuse me, we're going to ignore that. I'm sorry. Um, I would even say that the those angels are angles. If you're
Mm.
standing on the earth and you're looking out, each angel holds 5 degrees, is facing a different 5 degree portion of the sky. And since these portions expand as we look outwards, they actually become different compass directions. So the angels are astronomical angles and they wrap around the Milky Way. They're portions of the Milky Way. And so they're information that comes in from all different angles of the cosmos.
Hmm.
So even the angels that we think of as religious belief systems are a cover for different portions of the heavens, and different energies come in from different angles, right? All around us. The cosmos is huge. And so the energies that come in from these different angles are discrete and literally different from each other in substantial ways. And we have packaged that into this concept of angels, like we think of, as if they had discrete egos of separate names and personalities and all that. That's us projecting ourselves onto them, because in actual fact, they are pie slice regions of the sky through which different kinds of information reach us.
Hmm. Fascinating. Well, let me ask you how, because you talked a little bit about how with the English decks and wanting to incorporate these new planets that we found, um, that kind of like causes them to shuffle some of this around in a way that doesn't quite work. And this makes sense to me because I studied Hellenistic astrology. I studied with a Hellenistic astrologer, and one of the things that Hellenistic and I think also Renaissance astrologers get kind of frustrated with is like wanting to like rewrite the planetary rulerships by sticking in
Yes.
Uranus and Pluto and
Yeah.
Neptune. And it's like there's this really tight system that then you kind of break when you try to do that. And we would still, and I still use the um
Outer planets.
nutrients, yeah, the outer planets, to to bring in information and things like that. But like I was taught really clearly, like, yeah, please don't try to like put them into the rulership schemes. But I'm wondering too, how does that transition to understanding that we live in a heliocentric universe change some of these other correspondences, or does that cause any
Yeah,
disruption?
I don't see a conflict, but that's because I had to force myself. I learned Western astrology off the face of the cards. Then I had to address, oh God, look at all the math. Then I realized, wait a minute, this is the ancient cosmos that we've just added bells and whistles to. Let me go back to the ancients and find out how they taught it. So my most recent study has been Arabic astrology, which is basically the Arabs had to deal with Eastern astrologers at one end of their trade routes and Western astrologers at the other end of their trade routes. So they have everybody's methods. They have accounted for all the different styles and tricks and tools that different cultures have put together. And they did it all without the massive power of calculation that we have now. They did it by eye, by traveling under the night sky and learning, again, the portions of the Milky Way, the constellations they could see. And I'm just right now reading Homer's Secret Iliad. There's two books, Homer's Secret Iliad and Homer's Secret Odyssey. And they're all about the astronomical wisdom that's encoded in those two. That obviously Homer was serving as a bard and was keeping the information alive during a time when there wasn't necessarily an official, like he couldn't necessarily be with a builders guild. I mean, he was with the Storytellers Guild of his time, but this is another avenue, another chapter of these cultures to keep it all going.
Yeah, and I just want to say to people, because I know that there's going to be people listening to this when they hear stuff like Homer's Secret Iliad, they're like, oh, this is all this like nonsense where people want to think that there's always like someone's making up a secret, or they're studying this weird esoteric knowledge and trying to encode it into what they're writing. I'm like, no, it wasn't weird esoteric knowledge to them. It was the way that they thought about the world that they were living in, and they
Yes,
couldn't help but uh, have that be part of what they were speaking and writing about. And it wasn't to make it secretive so that nobody could really, only the right people could understand it necessarily. I mean, maybe sometimes they're doing that, but it's because it's part of these layers of meaning that make up the world that they're living in.
that's right. And they could, just like us, they could only speak in the vocabulary that was common to all of them. There's no point in hiding what you know in a language nobody else could speak. If a bard has the responsibility of maintaining the storylines of the people, that's because they're maintaining the wisdom tradition of those people. And those stories are going to have all kinds of layers of information laid into them. So it's us who are lacking in depth perception and seeing everything and just from our own point of view. And this goes back to the struggle between the heliocentric and geocentric. Um, all ancient astrology is geocentric because they understood we're standing on the earth and that everything that we are looking at, we have to read from our own point of view. So, an ancient chart, the native is at the center, and then the signs and planets are seen rotating around the native. And that's a really straightforward way of saying this chart is about this person at this particular point of time and space. This is not about the entire cosmos or the structure of the solar system. This is about this person. We're putting this person at the center. And that is the truth of all personal charts that, like it or not, it's all from the point of view of yourself. So um, it doesn't change a thing to take the off Earth point of view and say, well, haha, the sun is at the center of the solar system. Half of them knew that, depending upon which culture you talked about. Many knew that. They just, when you're doing human astrology, you do it on the scale of humans. And that means your feet are on the earth and you explain it that way. So that I had to undo that in my mind before I could finally just make Arabic astrology and Vedic astrology accessible to myself because I'd gotten so over tropicalized that I wasn't realizing, wait a minute. Also, lately, you can now buy astrology programs where they will print it out for you in Vedic or they will print it out for you in tropical, and it's exactly the same chart. It's just they've shifted the grid a little bit
Mm-hmm.
based on whether you're, Vedic astrology and Arabic astrology to a large degree is oriented towards constellations. So it's looking up and out.
Right.
Whereas tropical astrology is oriented towards the seasons. It's looking down towards, north, south, east, west, and the solstices and equinoxes. So they're both equally true and they're both mapping the same thing. One looks up, one looks down.
Yeah. And I think this is so necessary because I think, we're in a time right now where we've got a lot of confusion and conflict over what kind of how do we make sense and meaning of the world? And what do we do when we've got conflicting maps and models of the universe, right? And of what the world is. And I say this as someone who's been in what we call inner spiritual spaces for a while, where you've got people who are contemplative practice practitioners in Christianity and maybe Sufism or maybe Judaism or whatever, who are like trying to find like what are the commonality of our experiences? How do we make sense of the different language that we use for understanding things? And there are ways to kind of say like each has its own integrity when it's seen within its context. And we can layer them on top of one another and see where they line up. And there's going to be maybe some places where they don't line up. And that doesn't mean that one is right and one is wrong necessarily. It means that maybe they have different utilities for different things. And when I think about when I was studying with my astrology teacher, the thing he said was like, yes, we're using this geocentric system, and we know that the solar system is actually heliocentric, he said, but as a system for allowing the divine to speak to you through these symbols and whatnot, he's like, it works. It has coherence, it has integrity, and you can use it. And you don't have to like try to like, try to like cut it up and smush it around to make it fit into another framework.
Well, another thing that I would mention, which is paramount to this shift in how people think, is that both in astrology and in tarot, the framework you're using is a philosophy itself. In other words, the framework didn't just drop out of the sky. It was built up by a long time thought and care and refined and put through different tests and stuff. So by the time it comes to us, even without shuffling the cards and throwing out a particular reading, the actual structure of the deck and all the partitions within it and all the cards that appear when you use that structure, that framework, that is a wisdom teaching itself before you ever try apply it to anything. And so same with astronomy, the circle of the houses and the circle of the zodiac and the moving planets and all their dignities and treaty relations. And then, what happens when all their different political alignments and attractions and aversions are stimulated this way or that. That has to do with how you apply it for a given individual. But the model itself is itself a revelation. And say, if you're on the back of camels going through the desert at night because it's too hot in the daytime to travel, you have to, bed down in an oasis and get some rest, then you're learning the stories of the heavens by being there for it. It is, you can look up and see the framework of what our ancestors told us are the divisions up there. The mansions of the moon are 24-hour travel, 24 hours worth of motion in the moon. So every day the mansion makes it just like a camel train. It makes a certain amount of progress and then it beds down in the mansion of the night. And then it makes the next progress, fills itself up. The next night, it's at the next mansion, and it's at the oasis.
The moon are each trajectory that the moon is traveling each night or each day. Is that what you're
That's
saying?
the 13 degrees, 13 some odd degrees a day that the moon travels. Those are mansions, and
Okay.
they literally, you used to be able to judge how long your travel was going to be by how many mansions.
Yeah.
So you're reading, you're not just determining I have to do these many miles across the surface of the planet. You're thinking we have to walk through 16 mansions of the moon
Yeah.
because they would bed down at a new mansion every night. And, the moon became the calendar for some of these people because it's the most obvious and the most literal and it's the fastest moving and all that kind of stuff. So we have more than one zodiac. The mansions of the moon are another zodiac superimposed on the same 12 signs. It's always the same cycle, but you cut it up differently depending upon what planet or object you're tracking.
Yeah. Let me ask you something. What do you think for people who are drawn to this, or really to anybody, what do you think studying these ancient systems of engineering that you're really talking about, what do you think that they have to offer people, and how can they kind of speak to, I mean, is there something valuable? Like, what's the valuable thing there that you think our modern world is really missing that the study of this stream of wisdom would offer us?
Well, what I would say is this stream of wisdom is humanity's traditional ways of dealing with the fractal universe.
Mm,
We're already embedded in all these cycles,
yeah.
the cycles of the signs, the cycles of the moon, all that. Um, and that is what dictates to us what's happening next. It's not just my will or the king's will or the will of the weather djinn who changed the climate on us. We're embedded in this cosmos, and what it's doing is not irrational. It's slow and steady, and we can track it, and we can make order out of it if we want to. So this is the humanity's effort to bring order into the tumultuous chaos of just rolling around in unpredictable time. So when we get a grip on our lives, I mean, you look how people behave when they think everything's completely chaotic and out of control versus how they behave when they say, okay, this is a stage. When I get done with this stage, I'm going to move to the next stage. And if I work through the stages, then I'm going to get my goals achieved. It's a totally different manner of functioning. It's a totally different approach to the world. So whether you couch your astronomy in a sacred calendar like the Catholics do, where they have their sacred calendar, but they've got to watch the moon every year and change the calendar a little bit because it does depend on the astronomy.
Mhm.
Um, or whether they teach the astronomy directly, that's going to depend on what the culture you live in, whether they're allowing direct access to information or indirect access. In cultures where they hold this stuff very tight, they spend a lot of time screening people to find out who's got the mind to do this. And then they take you in and, ordain you and make you shut your mouth. But we're in a culture now where anybody who wants to study the inherent order, and as Jung said, this is the 5,000-year history of human psychology.
Mhm.
He's said that's what astrology is. But if astrology's the ordering structure for Tarot then offers that same 5,000 years of human psychology. And if there is no other usefulness than that, that's already huge because our understanding of psychology is just 100 years deep and barely touches the surface. And yet we have this great well of understanding about the human interaction with reality, and we think it's superstition, even though it's been scientists all along.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Well, we're getting to the end of our portion of the main portion of the episode. And so we're going to talk a little bit about where people can go and like how they can start to study this in more depth and also start working with tarot. But before we do, I'm wondering, Christine, if you could tell us a little bit about what you're up to right now and where people can find you and connect with your work.
Okay. The main place to find me, at least to find the Tarot, the Holy Light, and the books and stuff, is at the NoriaBrownfieldPress.com, right? I think that's where you found me, right? Um,
Um, I think I found you because I was looking for your deck. Yeah, that's where I found you.
that's right. Um, and there's a telephone number there. There's an email. There's a couple emails there that you can reach out to me. Um, I'm a little bit hidden because I'm writing so much right now, reestablishing my um, first book and other things that we're doing. But um, everything will be announced as it appears over at Noria Brownfield Press. Then there is the brand new Noria's Net Patreon, because my newest work will be appearing there as well. So I've been in this sort of interregnum where I'm not that much public facing, but people who are persistent will get through to me, and I do see clients, you know, as I can fit them in. It's a interesting period in my life right now. So when I am less hermitous in the future, there'll be more channels of access. But right now, those are the best places to look for what I'm doing.
Okay. Well, thank you. This has been a fascinating and amazing conversation. And I'm just really I'm a member of your Patreon and I haven't gotten a chance to get through all the videos and stuff yet, but I find your mind fascinating and the information that you have to offer fascinating. And I definitely recommend it to anyone who's interested in these things.
Well, thank you very much. It was really great to talk to you today.